When I when I was 20, something like that, 20, I started studying atrocity, right? And so I've always been interested in the Holocaust, Auschwitz in particular, but it's a very particular interest. Like evil, Nazi Germany, Auschwitz, prison guard who enjoyed his work, right? Because my question was, how could you be an Auschwitz prison guard who enjoyed his work?
For decades, Jordan Peterson has been saying that most of his work is predicated on understanding what motivated quote-unquote perfectly normal people to become Nazis and sadistically murder the Jews. Although he did not say that directly in the clip you just saw, he did express his interest in the subject. Again, he has said repeatedly that attempting to unpack what motivated the Nazis, or answer the question, how could you be an Auschwitz prison guard who enjoyed his work, forms the basis of everything he does.
Jordan Peterson, herzlich willkommen to the program.
Thank you, thank you.
Dr. Peterson, you've wrote this new book, The Ascent to Science. It will be out the next days here in Germany, and it's about identity. You're now visiting Germany. Germany is a country in, I would say, identity crisis. What is your analysis of Germany? What is your view on Germany and Western Europe these days?
And this is Jordan Peterson speaking in Germany with Julian Reichelt, a far-right propagandist who endorses neo-Nazism. Why would Peterson do an interview with him? Because when he says he's interested in answering the question, how could you be an Auschwitz prison guard who enjoyed his work, he means, how is it possible to construct you in a way that would cause you to become a Nazi and enjoy your work? And if you think what I'm saying sounds crazy, I would agree. In December of 2019, Peterson was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and within the realm of that disorder, implementing an evil scheme that will almost certainly never come to fruition is entirely normal. And pursue his malicious goal Peterson does, driven by delusion and madness. As he angrily informed an interviewer with British GQ, it'd be lovely if there was a strong man who could solve all our problems, and those who deserved it got exactly what was coming to them. Peterson keeps a list of those who deserve it, and he's forever sharing this list with his followers, many of whom appear to be resentful, badly educated, and mentally disturbed. As for Julian Reichelt, he manages a media outlet called Nius, spelled N-I-U-S. A journalist named Kira Ayadi penned an article about Nius for the Media Diversity Institute, wherein she says that Nius bypasses bona fide journalism and heads straight for the domain of right-wing populism, offering up stories laden with racism, sensationalism, and conspiracy theories. Ayadi likens Nius to Fox News and Julian Reichelt to Tucker Carlson. By Nius' own admission, a poll they conducted showed that 65% of their viewers agreed that Europeans were gradually being replaced by immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. In other words, they subscribe to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which Peterson has floated. See my video, Jordan Peterson, on the Jewish question. I should mention that in Germany, 85% of the population is classified as ethnically European, but lying about an impending replacement doubles as a neo-Nazi dog whistle. On top of railing against Germany's center-left parties, non-white immigrants, and liberalism in general, Nius supports the AfD, or Alternative for Deutschland, the political party that made major gains in the recent German federal election and scored a win in a state in former East Germany. The AfD is a radical, far-right organization that is anti-immigrant, anti-European Union, and seeks to sow internal division while undermining Germany's alliances with other Western democracies, as can be gleaned from this campaign sign, which reads, Washington spies, Brussels dictates, Berlin obeys. With consideration to Peterson's book about identity, code for racial, conservative, and neo-Nazi identity, the AfD has members with affiliations to the identitarian movement, which advocates for an ethnically and culturally homogeneous Europe that is as white as the driven snow. Germany can achieve such purity through repatriation, that is, the forced deportation of non-white residents, including citizens, to the countries of their racial origin. In 2024, senior members of the AfD were caught holding a meeting with neo-Nazis. On the agenda was a proposal to repatriate millions of people, including those deemed to be non-assimilated and with non-German backgrounds. Here's another AfD campaign sign, which says, "Start repatriation immediately." The German government has labeled factions of the AfD extremist, and to be sure, it's riddled with neo-Nazis. It aims to restore German pride by rejecting the culture of guilt that surrounds the country's Nazi past, a topic you will hear Reichelt and Peterson discuss. AfD politician Björn Höcke, who recently led his party to victory in the state of Thuringia, has said of the Berlin Holocaust Memorial that Germans are the only people in the world who plant a monument of shame in the heart of the capital. Höcke has branded Germany's approach to remembering its dark past laughable, and has proposed that Germany should not only have a 1,000-year past, but a 1,000-year future, an unsubtle allusion to Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. But then, the AfD has worked hard to reclaim language from the Nazi era, including the words Fatherland, Volk, and Völkisch, and party members have been caught posting anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi memes on social media, including a joke about Anne Frank being burned in an oven. In 2023, Björn Höcke was indicted for using the phrase Alles für Deutschland, which sounds a little like Alternative für Deutschland and means everything for Germany, during a campaign speech. Alles für Deutschland was a Nazi slogan and is therefore prohibited by German law. Björn Höcke claimed he had no idea that he was referencing the Nazis, yet he's a former history teacher who likes to conjure up the glories of his nation's past. Björn Höcke has direct ties to neo-Nazis and has advocated for the legalization of Holocaust denial, and he would be cheered on by Julian Reichelt, who Jordan Peterson agreed to sit down with for a friendly chat. Neo-Nazis do not come right out and say who they are. Instead, they deny they're neo-Nazis while using signals, dog whistles, and coded language that they think like-minded people can decode. During the interview, I will help you decipher that code while providing commentary on Peterson's rhetorical techniques.
What is your analysis of Germany? What is your view on Germany and Western Europe these days?
Well, Germany in particular is still, what would you say, living through the throes of historical guilt and trying to come to terms with that. You see that in the West quite broadly with its guilt with regard to, say, colonial past, which is an analog of the guilt that Germany as a society bears for what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s.
No sooner does Peterson make his German television debut than he raises the subject of Nazism, or what happened in Germany. Members of the Frankfurt School, who are mostly Jewish and who Peterson has criticized, were forced to flee Nazi Germany and became concerned about the possibility of another Holocaust after they returned. They noted that well into the 1950s, Hitlerism was just braiding below the surface, and the Germans were unwilling to talk candidly about their gruesome crimes, preferring instead to refer to the war as it and the Holocaust as what happened to the Jews. When it comes to Nazism, Peterson is forever employing this type of minimizing and concealing language.
That's a very difficult thing to sort out. What responsibility do you take for the cataclysms of the past? There's obviously a guilt that goes along with that, a survivor's guilt, an unworthy beneficiary guilt. And I would also say that the psychopathic radicals of the narcissistic left are unbelievably good at exploiting that. And it really works for conservative types in particular because they tend to be guilt prone.
Peterson is sending a signal by talking about the historical guilt despised by the German far right and characterizing liberals as psychopathic and narcissistic radicals. He's also gaslighting. He's a psychopathic and narcissistic radical. In The Rise of Jordan Peterson, his wife Tammy says that he had always talked like a revolutionary, but when he became famous, he began acting like one. However, if he's really warning us about how easily perfectly ordinary people can become Nazis, how could this be considered revolutionary? It's similar to what already happens in high school history classes.
And so, what do we do with our past? That's part of identity,
Yes.
right? And if your relationship with your past is disjointed, then you're going to be disjointed psychologically, and you're going to be disjointed with regard to your representation of the future. And so that makes you hopeless and confused in an anxiety-provoking manner, and also disunited. And so we see that everywhere in the West, probably most acutely in Germany.
Peterson is saying that Germans should not feel guilty about their past because it's bad for their mental health. The AfD's Bjorn Hawk has said that Hitler should not be seen exclusively as bad, and Peterson has said that he should not be blamed for what happened in the 1930s and 40s. See my video, Jordan Peterson, You Can't Blame Hitler.
So what is the pathway forward? Well, how do you atone for your sins, even your hereditary sins, let's say, to the degree that those exist, the sins that are visited upon the children for 7 generations, let's say? And the answer to that,
Note the pause. Peterson often claims that along with his research on Nazi motivation, he's been on a quest to devise a belief system that will keep his followers from joining the far right. He has said that his male adherents have told him that he saved them from the far right in a way that made it sound as if he were some kind of miracle worker. However, as for explicit advice, he doesn't say much beyond, don't do that. You would think that he'd have a detailed and digestible answer, but he doesn't. And here he pauses, mindful of his audience and wondering what to say.
It seems
you
it's going
live
the
in a
other
manner
way.
that decreases the probability that such things are going to happen again in the future. And that's key to identity.
More vague language. He cautions us to try to live in a manner that decreases the probability that such things will happen in the future. By such things, does he mean what happened in the 1930s and 40s? If so, exactly which things does he have in mind? Far from wanting to prevent another Holocaust, as he often implies, he wants his followers to act in a manner that will facilitate another Holocaust, one that won't be cancelled by the psychopathic radical left, who only want multiculturalism, which Peterson claims leads to war. Another purification campaign would be key to identity, racial and neo-Nazi identity.
I spent a lot of time studying the Holocaust, a lot of time. And I studied the worst elements of it that I could find, trying to extract out the moral. Well, the moral of the story is something like, don't be the sort of person that sits by idly when such things are occurring. Okay, but that's not some simple political command.
When Peterson talked about not sitting idly by when undefined things are occurring, he was sending a coded message to his acolytes to participate in such things. A coded message is not a simple political command.
It's not exactly even a characterological command. It's deeper than that. It starts to touch on what's sacred. You form a sacred alliance with the truth to stop your society from degenerating into hell.
Not standing idly by when genocide is occurring touches on what's sacred, and Hitler said that Germans had a sacred duty to ensure that the racial blood be guarded and the best types of humans preserved. He also spoke about a sacred enthusiasm to stand up for our Volk. Indeed, across Mein Kampf and his speeches, Hitler uses the word sacred more than 90 times. With the awareness that Mother and Child, or Mutter und Kind, was the name of a Nazi charity organization created to support pregnant women and young mothers who were considered Aryan, Hitler said, "A culture that doesn't hold the mother and child as sacred dies." Actually, that was said by Jordan Peterson. Hitler said, "The race that fails to come through the test will simply die." And Heinrich Himmler said, "Every German mother of good blood shall be holy to us." Peterson's sacred alliance with the truth is stolen from Hitler's. Those on the enemies list, including Jews and non-whites, should be eradicated in order to secure our identity and prevent our society from racial degeneration.
That's a much more serious investigation into identity of the sort that's now radically necessary, and that's partly what this book delves into. And so, what's the proper identity? We have a culture war about that. What's the proper identity? The worship of my own sexual proclivities? Yeah, I don't think so.
Note how he transitions from cryptic instructions concerning the Holocaust to slamming the LGBTQ+ community. He certainly knows who his audience is, reactionaries who would gladly oppress said community and advocate for so-called traditional values. And of course, there's a history of such persecution. As Jason Stanley, author of How Fascism Works, explains,
and this goes back in history to the original fascist movements. The National Socialists targeted Magnus Hirschfeld, a gay German Jew, who was the director of the Institute for Sexuelle Wissenschaft, that had the largest photographic evidence of gender variability. as well as 20,000 volumes of LGBT literature representing LGBT perspectives. And this whole collection was burned in the first Nazi book burning in 1933.
Next, Peterson will denigrate the worship of pride, meaning gay pride, which he has called a sin. A rural Albertan who wears pink dress shirts and cowboy boots, loves to describe the physiques of muscular, bare-chested men, takes a special interest in images of male nudes, writes about his grandmother's pubic hair, and has said at least twice that his cousin Diane was so indescribably hot that he still hasn't gotten over it, will decide for the rest of us which sexual orientations and practices are acceptable and which are verboten.
The worship of pride, that's a very bad idea. Those two things together, that's the worst possible idea. What's the alternative? Well, that's what we're trying to investigate with the Ark. That's what I'm trying to investigate with this book. And I believe the successful revitalizing revolutions that have occurred time and time again in Western culture have always been radical returns to the tradition.
The successful revitalizing revolution that needs to be a radical return to tradition is a Nazi revolution. Hitler, after all, was a revolutionary who alluded to a return to tradition, by which he often meant Germany's warring tradition, or, quote, the tradition of one's race. Across his writings and speeches, he appealed to tradition some 100 times and used the word revolution no less than 360 times.
It seems to me, talking about Germany and all the things you just mentioned, that a totalitarian past does not really protect you from totalitarian ideas and a totalitarian future, because all the totalitarian ideas, the rise of totalitarian ideas we see right now, it is happening in Germany
again,
especially. And again, I just came here from Berlin, and I drove through the city and I saw a building and it had the progressive pride flag on it, but not one flag, but 12 flags hanging next to it, as Germans are very thorough with their ideological flags. Why is that? Like, why does your past and your identity that you've tried, why doesn't it protect you from repeating your words?
Well, partly because we don't, you see.
That was Julian Reichelt, supporter of Alternative for Deutschland, likening members of the LGBTQ+ community to Nazis, or, in the tawdry parlance of our times, literal Nazis. When the left draws Nazi parallels, it's condemned as ridiculous, but when the right does it, it's justified. And it couldn't be that the AfD is totalitarian. I mean, granted, its members have opposed same-sex marriage, labeled feminism communism, and believe that the quote-unquote traditional family, that is, a heterosexual married couple with children, who adhere to a gendered and antiquated division of labor, should act as the standard. But hey, that's not prescriptive, it's far-right freedom. And how does Peterson reply to Reichelt's question about why queer totalitarianism is so prevalent? By invoking one of his favorite subjects, Auschwitz. As you listen, remember that the Third Reich persecuted about 100,000 men for being homosexual. Many were tortured into confessing their sexual preference, and as many as 3,600 were killed in concentration camps.
There's been an insistence since the end of the Second World War that we're not to forget what happened, let's say in Auschwitz. We're not to forget that. But the problem is, you see, you can't remember something you don't understand. Well, so then maybe you have an economic theory of the development of totalitarianism, or maybe you have a great man gone wrong theory. So Hitler, what would he deceived and demented the entire population of otherwise freedom-seeking individuals.
Maybe you view totalitarianism through the lens of economics, or perhaps you see Hitler as a great man gone wrong. Peterson certainly sees him as great, and has said, the Nazis were unbelievably great at using fire of purification as a symbolic message. You shouldn't be surprised. After all, the glorification of great men is a hallmark of fascism. So is mischaracterizing fascist history. I mean, really, the people who supported Hitler could be seen essentially as freedom-seeking individuals?
But those theories are insufficient, because totalitarianism isn't a top-down phenomena. It's a thoroughly distributed fractal phenomena. You have a totalitarian state when every single person lies about absolutely everything they say and do every time they open their mouths or think, right? And so that makes it something much more akin to well, what's being portrayed classically as a spiritual battle. If you want to eradicate the usurping totalitarian spirit, that's the spirit of Lucifer, by the way, then you do that by putting your own soul in order. And that's been the insistence in the West on the Judeo-Christian side for 5,000 years. And it's right. It's not a political issue. And we like to assume that the problem with totalitarianism is the problem with Caesar. But the problem with Caesar is the problem with Lucifer. And so that's a deeper problem. And people don't like that. And it's not surprising, you know. I mean, when I read totalitarian history, I always read it as a perpetrator.
The Frankfurt School suggested that when studying the Holocaust, one should imagine oneself to be a perpetrator, bystander, and victim. But Peterson never talks about reading about Nazi atrocities from the perspective of the victims. Mind, he goes on about Hitler's numberless talents, but he tends to gloss over what happened, as it were, to the Jews. Unless you count when he implies that he could victimize the Jews, and that you could too.
You think, oh, well, I couldn't enjoy taking someone off a train car where many people have frozen to death in the middle of the winter, isolated from their family, putting a 100-pound bag of wet salt on their backs, having them march from one side of the city, the compound, the camp, to the other and then back again. I couldn't enjoy that. It's like, don't kid yourself. You could enjoy that, not me. It's like, the more you think that, the less likely you are to be helpful when the crunch comes. And the crunch is always coming.
If you don't realize you could become Luciferian to counter what Peterson has described as the satanic left, what good are you going to be when the Holocaust Part 2 comes? I mean, okay, many people don't like the idea of channeling their inner demon and slaughtering innocents, but you might. In fact, you could probably enjoy it. Peterson could enjoy it, and has been plainly admitting this for years. Schizophrenia is a devastating brain disease. When Peterson talked about totalitarianism not being top-down but based on communal lying, he was at once vilifying progressives, this is what they do, they lie all the time, and instructing his followers on how to achieve a totalitarian society. Ambiguous language is one of Peterson's favorite techniques. He's spent decades perfecting it. As for suggesting that totalitarianism is the upshot of the spirit of Lucifer, know that in Maps of Meaning, Peterson describes Lucifer as the spirit of unbridled rationality, and in 12 Rules for Life, he says Lucifer is the spirit of reason. Therefore, we can deduce that Peterson believes totalitarianism is reasonable. But then he said that if the Nazis wanted to win the war, they should have had the Jews work toward the war effort and then liquidate them afterward, because this would have been, quote, the logical thing to do. In the next clip, Reichelt and Peterson will discuss the problem with social media.
And the problem with social media, one of the problems, is that there is no consequence for being a provocative psychopath online. In fact, quite the contrary. And this is a very bad problem because about, clinically speaking, 3 to 4% of the population at any given time are psychopathic narcissists, kind of radical form of power-seeking, hedonism-seeking immaturity. It's a good way of conceptualizing it. Now and then those people get the upper hand, and then literally all hell breaks loose. And we're definitely facilitating that online.
Again, this is Peterson employing ambiguous speech. The psychopathic narcissists who face no consequences for their online antics are both the Marx-loving woke flakes and the irritated ne'er-do-wells who Peterson is trying to enlist. The woke flakes face no consequences, and this is unjust. There should be rules. Simultaneously, Peterson's ideal listener faces no consequences and should remember this because they can go online and be as psychopathic as they want while acting as a mouthpiece for his ideology of intolerance and hate. Remember, totalitarianism is not a top-down phenomenon. For it to succeed, everyone has to lie. Next, JP is going to talk about how only a small percentage of people are psychopaths, but how they can cause untold damage. Peterson knows that psychopathy can spread like a virus, like it was by the Nazis, and like it is by the AfD, Nius, and him.
That's an illusion driven by a small percentage of people, but that doesn't mean it isn't cataclysmically dangerous, because a small percentage of the population can cause an unbelievable amount of trouble, and are inclined to, right? They want to dance in the runes. They've partly because they feel that in their unwillingness to make the proper sacrificial offerings, their best path to hedonic gratification and power is to devastate everything and to be the ruler of the ruins. That's operating in the back.
And they have global reach now in their hands with the smartphone
Yeah.
and social media.
More ambiguous speech. He's depicting liberals as anarchists who want to dance in the ruins, while hoping his maladjusted acolytes will visualize themselves as anarchists dancing in the ruins and support his successful revitalizing revolution. Over the years, Peterson has revealed how morbidly fascinated he is by antisocial behavior and the speed at which it can sweep through society like a contagion. He finds it encouraging. And in this image, you can see him at a TEDx talk showing a picture of someone dancing in front of ruins alongside a German propaganda poster that says, "In the end, there is victory." He then showed a Nazi propaganda portrait of Hitler as a knight coupled with the anarchy symbol. The talk was called Redefining Reality. Peterson would like to redefine reality by obliterating democracy and ushering in totalitarianism. That way, others would finally know what it's like to experience the irritation, anxiety, depression, and confusion that he does due to his schizophrenia.
It seems to me that smartphones, social media, the connected world has kind of globalized ideology. You know, coming from Germany, reading history, you know, my impression always was, you know, there were crazy places in history, but you could escape them. You know, you could go to England or, you know, try to make your way to Switzerland or on a boat to the US. But this kind of, this new totalitarianism seems to be everywhere. It's, you know, it's in universities now. It's around the globe. It's, you know, everywhere where there are smartphones. Is it possible that, you know, we're seeing a rise of a new tyranny that is global, that you cannot escape?
Well, I think we could go in that direction. The Chinese have gone in that direction. And they're mapping the route for everyone if we want it. There's certainly a vicious pull in that direction. There's plenty of counter movement. You know, I would say that's probably most evident in the United States. It's probably second most evident possibly in Great Britain, possibly. We'll see. But in the States, for sure. I mean, it's not as if the globalist totalitarians have won the battle in the United States. In fact, I don't think they have.
Reichelt has convinced himself that modern-day liberalism is indistinguishable from the ideology that dominated Nazi Germany. Only now, because of the snowflake internet, Germans cannot flee the country to escape it. And Peterson compares it to the mindset that governs communist China, a paranoid police state where citizens are constantly lied to, treated like objects, denied human and constitutional rights, and subject to arbitrary detention, incarceration, torture, show trials, and execution. Oh, and this new totalitarianism is global, hence Peterson's phrase, globalist totalitarians. Globalism is a neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic dog whistle. It refers to a secretive New World Order run by a cabal of scheming Jews, and it has its roots in Nazism. Hitler was forever banging on about the scourge of Marxist internationalism and depicted the Jews as internationalist traitors. When Peterson said that there was opposition to the globalist totalitarians in the US, he was referring to Trumpism. He praised and defended Trump before and after January 6th, and recently said this to Piers Morgan.
Well, if I could vote in the American election, I would vote for Trump. And I don't trust Harris. Now, do I trust Trump? Well, he was president for 4 years.
When Peterson alluded to resistance in the UK, he had in mind the 2024 United Kingdom riots, in which far-right and neo-Nazi groups hijacked the stabbing deaths of 3 children to engage in a vicious spate of violence, including arson, looting, and racist attacks. In this image, you can see members of such groups bearing a flag adorned with anarchy symbols. Recall Peterson's image of Hitler and an anarchy symbol. One of the main facilitators of the riots was the founder of the now-defunct English Defence League, Tommy Robinson, a train-spotting-like thug who cut his teeth as a football hooligan, boasts an extensive criminal record, and has a racist streak a mile wide. For example, in 2023, Robinson went to London to attend an anti-Semitism march. Before and after the riots, Peterson published no fewer than 10 videos wherein he interviewed Tommy Robinson, who he's been supporting for years.
You just mentioned the US, you just mentioned UK pushing back on this movement. It's not that visible here in Germany.
The AfD is alarmingly visible in Germany, but Reichelt and Peterson never mentioned it.
What do you think is the most important thing for conservatives in Germany to understand how to push back in this culture war that you also describe and mention in your book? Because conservatives in Germany usually say, we don't want to get engaged in culture wars. We don't even accept that term. That's not what we are. But the other side seems to be very serious about it. So what do you tell them?
Well, conservatives have a proclivity to put their head down and focus on the immediate problems in front of them and try to solve them practically. And that's fine when you're not rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, so to speak. But but the problem is that we are in a culture war, and the conservatives can put their head in the sand all they want with that in that regard. And that'll mean two things. The lefties get the upper hand and win, and the conservatives will just turn into slow motion progressives. Well, that's not helpful, and that is definitely what's happening.
Social progress is not helpful. We need to take society into the past, specifically Germany's past between 1933 and 1945.
The most, the biggest, the strongest trend in at least German conservatism I observe still is that they want to be liked by the left. That that is what that is what they aim for. They want to be liked by that. The culture.
You can't fill a bottomless pit. You can't satisfy people whose fundamental orientation is dissatisfaction. There's no pleasing the left. There's no limit to inclusivity, right? The opposite of a thesis is not...
Should one apologize to the left? In general, should one apologize to the left when they go after you, or is that already suicide?
No, you don't apologize.
Peterson never apologizes for anything because he's a narcissist and a psychopath.
If you haven't done anything wrong, then you shouldn't apologize, because that's a lie.
Remember, he's not only coaching his own followers, but an audience where 2/3 of German viewers may believe they're being replaced by non-whites. Now watch as Peterson offers up some sage advice on the topic of racial preference.
And the same thing might apply with regards to ethnocentricity and racial preference, for that matter. People have a pronounced in-group preference, and it's very easy to make that into a cudgel of guilt, but it's not helpful.
Given that Peterson began the interview by ridiculing the culture of guilt that stems from Nazi Germany, perhaps we can presume that it's not helpful to guilt the far-right types about their in-group preference in regard to Germany's present and its past.
And diversity obviously fuels what, can be a threat to identity, mass migration. And that is something we see in Europe. That is something we see in the US. It's something that we see all around the Western world. And the presumption here presented by the left is diversity will make us all stronger. We will all be stronger if less and less people have less in common in the future. Why are they doing that?
Well, as James Lindsay says, never forget that it's always about the revolution.
And who is James Lindsay? According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, he's a far-right author who has denigrated the LGBTQ+ community, shared conspiracy theories about the communist takeover of the world, mocked the death of George Floyd on the anniversary of January 6th, and spread the white genocide theory that Marxists want to liquidate the white race. He has also bolstered an argument that Marxism is evil by citing Mein Kampf. To restate, the revolution Peterson is alluding to is predicated on Hitler's revolution, a revolution to annul democracy and inaugurate fascism. A search through Peterson's writings reveals that he's had revolution on his mind since at least 1985. Across his first 3 books, he makes direct reference to revolution 156 times. Moreover, he's linked revolution to the phrase New Order, which is interesting because Hitler spoke of a new order, and My New Order is a book of Hitler's speeches that was published in 2016. In 2017, Peterson used its cover as the image for a video of one of his psychology lectures, only to later replace it with his maps of meaning icon. Peterson, every revolution produces a new order. Hitler, establishing a new and better order, for us, the revolution. Peterson, new and benevolent order. Hitler, new and better world order. Peterson, re-establish order. Hitler, a new order will be established. So, Peterson and Hitler associate revolution with a new order, and Peterson has said,
and this is where the movie starts to draw on essentially Nazi symbolism, at least the symbolism of totalitarian states. And you think about You think about a totalitarian state, you think about the Nazis and their goose stepping. And what's happening is that every single person in the military becomes an identical unit, right? They're all uniform, and they're all, in some sense, imitating the dictator in an absolutely perfect way. And so the dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the entire population. That's order. Order.
Remember Peterson saying that if Germans felt guilty about their past, they would feel disjointed and disunited? Well, how better to fix that problem than by adopting strict uniformity? That's order. Bearing in mind that Peterson has called the Canadian government communist and Marxist, in 12 Rules for Life, he writes, "Bureaucratic stagnation and oppression is underway, and you've contributed by pretending it was okay. Why not complain? Why not take a stand? If you do, other people, equally afraid to speak up, may come to your defense, and if not, maybe it's time for a revolution." Peterson says things like this often, but no one seems to notice. He said something similar in his interview with Nius.
Part of the reason we put together this Alliance for Responsible Citizenship was to bring conservatives and classic liberals together from around the world, especially those who were feeling so isolated that they didn't have enough courage to speak. It's like, well, I'm alone. No, you're not. The people that would ally themselves with you are hidden. We want to bring them out into the open and say, no, look, we're the majority and we've got the moral high ground in every fundamental manner, as long as we're willing to pay the appropriate price.
He means as long as we're willing to risk arrest and prosecution. Sometimes revitalizing revolutions are unsuccessful, as was the 2022 siege of Ottawa undertaken by the Freedom Convoy, which hoped to overthrow the Canadian government under the pretense of ending COVID-19 mandates. Peterson lamented that his U.S. speaking tour made joining the Freedom Crew impossible, but he did manage to interview 2 of the organizers. But then he would, because several of the organizers made racist and pro-Nazi remarks on top of floating far-right conspiracy theories. One organizer Peterson interviewed was Tamara Leach, who was recently tried for mischief, intimidation, and counseling others to break the law, and is currently awaiting the verdict. Or, as Peterson would see it, Leach was unfairly prosecuted by Canada's communist regime for bravely overcoming her fears and standing up to the radical left, who are out to silence you.
Of course you should be afraid to stand up as an individual to the radical left. Why? Because they'll devastate you with their gossip mongering and their psychopathic, what would you say, reputation savaging, cowardly, anonymous reputation savaging and mobbing. Of course you should be afraid of that. What should you be afraid more of? Losing your tongue, right? Losing your soul. That's way worse.
Rule 1 in 12 Rules for Life is stand up straight with your shoulders back. This is code for stand like a soldier and fight, because, as you know, it may be time for a revolution. Now watch as Peterson dispenses more life advice.
If you're going to stand up and fight, you should have a strategy. Plus, you shouldn't do it alone. So you can be destroyed, but 4 of you probably couldn't be, right? If you guys linked arms. And because it's a lot harder to go after 4 people than 1, like it's kind of exponentially more difficult.
And in case there was any doubt about what we conservatives are supposed to stand up and fight against when facing down the lefties.
I think part of the way you fight back against that is by pointing out the obvious. It's like, okay, fine, so multiculturalism. All right, so the world's multicultural. Well, has it been peaceful historically? No. I mean, there's been wars between people with different views. Yeah. Oh, I see. So these people are going to magically come to the West, and all that they're going to bring with them is the plethora of benefits that go along with being diverse and none of the pathologies. That's your theory. That's a stupid theory. You know, and you hope that people of goodwill can negotiate peacefully, because the alternative is war. And it is the alternative, and you can see that.
Yes.
And
It's
the
already
idea
going
that
on
we're
as
not
a-
importing that war with this kind of like open-armed invitation to mass migration, that's a fool's hell, fundamentally. Obviously, we're importing that.
Obviously, we're importing a war. Now watch and learn about the 2 types of immigrants with whom we may have to go to war.
Just briefly back to mass migration, which is a huge trend we're seeing now all over the Western world. What do you think it does do to the brain, to identity? What does it do to society suddenly, especially from Muslim/Islamist societies? What does it do suddenly having that in, you know, a street that you've known for 30 years and that looks completely different within a year?
Well, in the biblical corpus, there's two kinds of foreigner. All right. There's the foreigner who comes in with poisonous ideas that's just like a plague. It's just devastating. And there's the foreigner who comes in when your culture itself is corrupt and is the only one who has the wisdom to tell you what's wrong. And that is the eternal conundrum that you face when you face a stranger.
There are two types of immigrants. Ones who are wise and point out your culture's corruption, and others who come in with poisonous ideas and are just like a plague. Hitler referred to the Marxists and Jews as a plague and said they were poisonous. In Mein Kampf, he writes about the Marxist plague and lauds the German workers for shaking off the poisonous clutches of that plague. And Peterson knows this because at the esteemed University of Toronto, he lectured on how one could bolster their immune system by adopting conservatism, before going on to discuss how Hitler attempted to elicit feelings of disgust by likening the Jews to a plague, virus, disease, and so on. And this is another one of JP's techniques. He describes Nazi rhetorical stratagems and then practices them.
All right. There's the foreigner who comes in with poisonous ideas that's just like a plague. Started to target the people that he didn't consider pure as parasites, capitalizing on the behavioral immune system and people's intrinsic sense of disgust. And so I'm going to show you some of the propaganda that did that so that you know how this sort of thing works. Okay, so what do you think? How do you think and talk if you're possessed by disgust? The state did, these are from Hitler's utterances. The state did not possess the power to master the disease. The menacing decay of the Reich was manifest. The masses feel that the mere fact of the Jews' existence is as bad as the plague. Politicians tinkering around on the German national body saw at most the forms of our general disease, but blindly ignored the virus. The nation did not grow inwardly healthier, but obviously languished more and more. It's all disease metaphor. It's all disease metaphor. The Jew must take care that the plague does not die.
Peterson's far-right rhetoric is not very different from that of Donald Trump or Tommy Robinson, only he's more subtle, knowledgeable, and expressive, and sprinkles his speech with allusions to Jung, Nietzsche, and distorted factoids from the field of psychology. In the summer of 2024, Jordan Peterson did this interview with a German fascist, repeatedly platformed Tommy Robinson at a time when Robinson was facing yet more scrutiny from the British government, media, and police due to his paramilitary mentoring of the goons who hoped to dance in the UK's ruins, and admitted that he'd read and enjoyed books by Satanists, including Aleister Crowley, while interviewing the daughter of a Satanist. Yet, if you look around the internet, you will find that no one seems to be alarmed, including the people who publish critical videos about Peterson, and that's because they do not understand who he is. A violence-obsessed schizophrenic whose illness drives him to try and bring about a revolution built on the philosophical pillars of Nazism and Luciferianism. Peterson's critics would likely laugh at my assessment, but ultimately the joke is on them, because they don't get it, and Peterson knows it. He sometimes says that the left has no idea what he's up to, and by and large, he's correct. Watch as he says something like that again, followed by a near admission from Reichelt that he does understand who Peterson is, a Nazi.
I'm basically left alone now. And the reason for that, in part, except by the right-wing Nazi trolls who've just emerged in droves again, but the left basically leaves me alone. And part of the reason for that is they've exhausted their artillery.
Yes. It doesn't work anymore.
Well, they pushed it to the limit.
Yes.
It's like when I was accused of being Red Skull, for example, right?
In Germany, they now call everyone a Nazi who disagrees.
Yeah, right.
They use, the hardest possible word, and no one believes it anymore.
Says someone from the German far right who supports German neo-Nazis and may well be a Nazi. Neo-Nazis and far-right extremists spend an inordinate amount of time hammering home the message that Nazis do not exist. Peterson does this in between saying that they do exist, that he knows he could be a Nazi, that Nazi represents a component of his personality, that his best friend in Fairview, Alberta was just like Adolf Hitler, that everyone is a sadistic Nazi who has a piece of Hitler in them, that everyone would be Hitler if they only had his genius and organizational skills, and that neo-Nazis have contacted him looking to form a partnership. A lot of internet liberals also believe that neo-Nazis do not exist, thereby suggesting that you're just as likely to encounter a unicorn or an elf. When Peterson rose to fame in 2016, he would never have been so brazen as to do an interview with a German far-right figure in which he engaged recurrently in thinly veiled neo-Nazi signaling, but he knows that his critics have lost interest or create content about him that tends to be irrelevant. He also knows that with the American election looming, the US media has bigger fish to fry, while Canadian media has lost the plot or muzzled itself. In Canada, the press is extremely cautious about what they say about Jordan Peterson and tend to describe him as polarizing and controversial. I'm confident that the CBC is aware of his pro-Nazi utterances but refuse to publish them. But then they refuse to report on the 2024 German federal election and the win for the AfD on the national news. The reluctance of Canada's liberal media flagship to cover far-right extremism, specifically neo-Nazism, including Jordan Peterson's cult, means that Canada's most prominent neo-Nazi is left alone to do what he wants. Indeed, his German interview must have been a lifelong dream come true.
Amen. Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson.
You bet.
Thank
Nice
you.
talking
Thank
to
you
you.
very much.
Yep.
Das war eine Sonderausgabe von Schuler. Fragen, was ist ohne Ralf Schuler? Dafür mit Dr. Jordan Peterson. Sehr geehrt, dass er bei uns war. Herzlichen Dank. Vielen Dank, Dr. Peterson.
For an in-depth analysis of Peterson's ties to neo-Nazism and the far right, please read The Devil and His Due: How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe and feel free to share.